Let me ask you one question. Have you ever opened your banking app 3 days after payday and felt your stomach drop because the number staring back at you was already smaller than you expected? Have you ever wondered how some people seem to build real wealth on an ordinary salary while others earn the exact same amount and still feel broke every single month? If your paycheck doubled tomorrow, would your life actually change? Or would your spending simply grow to swallow it whole, leaving you right back where you started, waiting for the next deposit? Today's story is about a young man named Michael, a supermarket attendant who believed that a low salary was the only thing standing between him and a better life, until one painful evening on a quiet street taught him a lesson that changed the direction of his entire future. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because on this channel we share powerful, true-to-life stories about discipline, financial wisdom, hope, and the small daily choices that quietly decide the shape of a person's future. Stay until the end, because this story might change the way you look at your very next paycheck. In a quiet, unremarkable town, in a neighborhood where the streets were narrow and the houses leaned close together, there lived a young man named Michael. He was 24 years old, and if you asked anyone who knew him, they would tell you he was not lazy. Michael woke up before 6 every morning, laced up shoes that were beginning to wear thin at the sole, and walked nearly 40 minutes to the supermarket where he worked, because he could not afford the bus fare every single day. He spent his shifts stocking shelves, greeting customers with a tired smile, lifting boxes that strained his back, and mopping aisles long after his legs had started to ache. By the time he walked home each evening, his shirt was soaked through with sweat, his feet throbbed, and his mind was foggy with exhaustion. And yet, after all of that effort, his paycheck barely covered the basics. He used to joke with his coworkers during their short breaks, saying, "We're not really working for money anymore, we're just working so we don't go hungry." Everyone would laugh, but underneath the laughter, they all knew it wasn't really a joke at all. Michael lived alone in a small rented room at the back of an old building. The roof leaked whenever the rain grew heavy, leaving a damp patch on the ceiling that seemed to grow a little larger every season. His mattress sat directly on the concrete floor because he had never managed to save enough for a proper bed frame. The single fan in the corner rattled and barely stirred the air on hot nights. Some evenings, he skipped dinner entirely, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he needed to be certain he had enough coins left for transport to work the next morning. It was a hard, narrow kind of life, the kind where every single decision felt like it mattered, and yet Michael had developed one habit that made everything harder than it needed to be. On the day his salary landed in his account, something inside him shifted. For a few hours, he didn't feel like a supermarket worker living paycheck to paycheck. He felt in his own mind like a man who had finally made it. His friends knew the schedule better than he did, and the moment the money arrived, his phone would buzz. "Michael, we're going out tonight. Come on, man, you only live once." And almost without thinking, he would agree. They would head to a loud, crowded club, order drinks they couldn't really justify, buy food they didn't need, and spend the night taking photos that made their lives look far more glamorous than they actually were. Sometimes Michael would walk past a shop window, see a pair of shoes or a shirt he liked, and buy it on the spot. Not because he needed it, but because some quiet, anxious part of him didn't want anyone to look at him and think he was struggling. For those few hours under the lights, surrounded by laughter and music, he felt important. He felt like he belonged among people who had it all figured out, but the feeling never lasted. Exactly 1 week later, without fail, reality returned to knock on his door. His wallet would be empty. His bank balance would sit at a number so low it barely registered. His kitchen cupboards would echo with nothing but the sound of his own footsteps. And so he would begin the quiet, familiar ritual of counting down the days until his next payday, watching the calendar the way a prisoner watches a clock, waiting for release that would only bring the same cycle right back around again. One afternoon, walking home from a long shift, Michael passed a small roadside restaurant. The smell of roasted chicken drifted out into the street, thick and warm, and his stomach growled so loudly he almost laughed at himself. He reached into his pocket and counted what was left. It was barely enough for a single loaf of bread. He stood there for a long moment, watching other people sitting comfortably at the tables inside, eating meals he couldn't afford, laughing over plates piled high with food. Then, quietly, without a word, he turned and walked away. That night, he lay on his thin mattress, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, and he finally whispered the question that had been building inside him for months. I work every single day, so why does my life never change? The following month, almost like clockwork, the exact same pattern repeated itself. Salary, clubbing, shopping, eating out, an empty wallet, waiting again for payday. His life had folded itself into a circle that never seemed to end, a wheel that kept turning without ever moving him forward. Then came the Saturday evening that would end up changing everything. Michael was walking home after a long shift, taking his usual shortcut through a quieter part of the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to dip below the rooftops, painting the sky in soft orange light. Children chased each other down the street, and a few elderly neighbors sat outside their doorways talking quietly among themselves. As Michael passed one particular rental house, he heard raised voices. He slowed his steps and saw a landlord standing at the gate, his face twisted with frustration and anger. Beside him stood a frightened tenant, a man not much older than Michael's own father, and next to that man stood two worn bags that clearly held everything his family owned. The landlord's voice rang out sharply. "I've given you enough time. You've been working every single day, so where is my rent? If you can't pay, then get out of my house or go and build one of your own." The tenant's wife stood a few steps behind him, tears already streaming down her face, while their young daughter clutched tightly at the fabric of her mother's dress, too frightened to say anything at all. The tenant lowered his head in shame. "I'll pay next month, I promise." But the landlord only shook his head, unmoved. "I've heard that every single month. You work, but you never plan. Leave." Michael stood frozen at the edge of the road, unable to move, unable to look away. Something about those words struck him harder than he expected. They didn't feel like they were meant only for the tenant standing there with his bags and his crying wife. They felt like they were meant for him too. You work, but you never plan. He looked down at his own worn shoes, then glanced back toward the small rented room only a few streets away that he could barely call home. A single, terrifying thought crept into his mind and refused to leave. What if one day I'm the one standing exactly where that man is standing right now? That thought followed him all the way home, and it followed him into his sleep that night. For the first time in his life, Michael began to understand something he had never truly considered before. It wasn't only his small salary that was keeping him poor, it was what he chose to do with that salary the moment it landed in his hands. The very next morning, instead of sleeping in as he usually did on his day off, Michael got up early and walked, almost without thinking, toward the town library, a building he had passed 1,000 times but had never once entered. Inside, rows of quiet shelves stretched out before him, and a handful of people sat reading in the soft morning light. He wandered slowly between the aisles until one title on a worn spine caught his eye: How to Build Wealth on a Small Income. He pulled it from the shelf, borrowed it at the front desk, and carried it home like it was something fragile. That night, he opened the book and began to read. The very first chapter caught him off guard. It didn't promise overnight riches. It didn't offer secret shortcuts or clever tricks. Instead, it stated plainly, "A small salary is not your biggest problem. A lack of a plan is." Michael stopped reading and stared at that single sentence for a long, long time because it described his life with uncomfortable accuracy. When his next payday arrived, something was different. He didn't answer his friends' calls to go to the club. When they asked where he was, he simply replied, "I'm staying home tonight." They laughed at him over the phone. "What happened to you? Did someone make you old overnight?" Michael laughed quietly along with them, but held his ground. "No, I just don't want my whole future to disappear in one weekend." That evening, for the first time in years, he cooked his own dinner at home. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't the kind of meal you'd photograph for anyone else to see, but it was enough, and it was his. He found an old notebook, dusted it off, and began writing down every expense he had: his rent, his food, his transport, and for the very first time, a small line labeled savings. For the first time in his adult life, his salary had a direction. It had a purpose beyond simply disappearing. Of course, change never comes easily, and Michael's transformation was no exception. Days turned into weeks, and the shift inside him was slow, sometimes painfully slow. There were mornings he wanted nothing more than to sleep in and skip his reading. There were evenings he ached to call his old friends and join them one more time, just to feel that old rush of belonging again. There were moments in front of shop windows when he almost bought another pair of shoes he didn't need, purely because everyone around him seemed to have a pair just like it. But each time that pull grew strong, he thought back to that family standing outside the rented house, clutching their 2 bags, with nowhere left to go. And each time he quietly set the shoes back on the shelf and walked on. If you're still watching this story, don't just feel sorry for Michael. Ask yourself one honest question right now. Which one of Michael's old habits is quietly keeping you from the life you actually want? And if this story is speaking to you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because sometimes one single lesson, absorbed at the right moment, can change the entire course of a lifetime. The next morning, Michael woke before sunrise, not because his shift demanded it, but because he had made a quiet decision to become a different kind of man. He made his bed, prepared a simple breakfast, and read 10 pages from his book before heading out the door. Under his breath, he repeated a phrase that was slowly becoming his anchor. One day at a time. At the supermarket, nothing on the surface had changed. He still stocked the same shelves, still carried the same heavy boxes, still earned the exact same modest salary as before. But something inside him had shifted completely. While his co-workers spent their lunch breaks complaining about their pay, Michael quietly opened his notebook and filled its pages with ideas, small business concepts, savings targets, and plans for a future he had never dared to imagine before. Some of his co-workers noticed and teased him gently. "Michael, you really think scribbling in that little notebook is going to make you rich?" He would just smile and answer, "No, but it might stop me from staying poor." The teasing continued for a while, but Michael found that he genuinely no longer cared what anyone else thought. Every payday from that point on followed the same disciplined routine. He paid his rent first, before anything else could tempt him. He bought only what he truly needed. He cooked his own meals instead of eating out, and he set aside a small amount of savings before spending a single dollar on anything extra. At first, those savings looked almost laughably small, some months barely enough to fill a modest envelope. But Michael kept returning to another line from his book that had lodged itself firmly in his mind. Never laugh at small savings. One day they become big opportunities. Months rolled into a full year. And then, for the very first time in his life, Michael reached the end of a month and discovered he still had money left over. He stared at the number in disbelief, running the math over and over in his head just to be sure it was real. He smiled, not because he had suddenly become wealthy, but because for the first time he felt like he was finally in control of his own life, instead of simply being carried along by it. Meanwhile, his old friends continued living exactly as they always had. Every payday brought another celebration. Every month, they found themselves borrowing money just to survive until the next paycheck arrived. One evening, they invited Michael out again, half mocking, half genuine. "Come on, man, you've changed. You never have any fun anymore." Michael looked at them with a calm, gentle smile that surprised even himself. "I still have fun," he said, "but now I actually enjoy sleeping peacefully at night because I know tomorrow's bills are already taken care of." They laughed it off and drove away into the night. But something in Michael's chest had grown quiet and steady, a feeling he had never known before. Years passed, and Michael never stopped learning. He read books on discipline, personal finance, small business, and self-improvement, often staying up later than he should have, absorbing every page like it was water in a drought. Every morning, he rose before sunrise, not because anyone forced him to, but because these habits had slowly, quietly become simply who he was. He worked hard at the supermarket by day and spent his evenings learning by lamplight. Bit by bit, he began building a very small side venture of his own. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't quick. There were entire months where it earned him almost nothing at all, months where he questioned whether any of it was worth the effort. But Michael refused to quit, because every time doubt crept in, he remembered exactly what his old life had looked like. Waiting anxiously for payday, living one fragile week at a time. He promised himself he would never go back to that. Slowly, painstakingly, his savings grew into enough for a deposit on a small piece of land on the edge of town. Years later, that same land became the site of his very first small rental house. The modest rent from that one house helped him build a second and eventually a third. He never rushed the process. He never borrowed recklessly just to impress people who wouldn't remember his struggle anyway. He built everything slowly, carefully, patiently, brick by brick, decision by decision. Even as his circumstances improved, he continued living simply. He still cooked most of his meals at home. He still planned every single paycheck the moment it arrived, exactly as he had taught himself to do all those years earlier. One quiet afternoon, Michael found himself walking down that same familiar road where, years before, he had watched a frightened family being forced out of their rented home with nothing but 2 bags to their name. He stopped walking, looked around at the houses lining the street, and allowed himself a small, private smile. It wasn't because he had become famous. It wasn't because he had become the richest man in town. It was because, for the first time in his adult life, he no longer feared losing the roof over his own head. A few years after that, Michael finished building his own modest home, a home that belonged entirely to him. The day he received the keys, he stood alone inside the empty living room, sunlight pouring in through the windows, and let the silence settle around him. He thought back to all the nights he had gone to bed hungry, all the paydays he had emptied within a single reckless weekend, all the tears he had hidden because some part of him had once truly believed his life would never change. He looked slowly around the empty room, closed his eyes, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you," to no one in particular, and to everyone who had ever doubted him at once. Not long after, his mother came to visit him for the very first time in his new home. She walked slowly through each room, running her fingers along the fresh paint on the walls, and when she finally turned to look at her son, her eyes were filled with tears. Michael grew worried immediately. "Mom, what's wrong?" She smiled through the tears streaming down her face. "When you were young," she said softly, "I used to lie awake worrying that your small salary would never be enough to give you a good life." She looked around the room once more, taking it all in. "I was wrong." Michael pulled her into a tight embrace, and for a long moment, neither of them said another word. Sometimes love simply doesn't need words at all. As the years went on, people around town stopped thinking of Michael as the tired young supermarket attendant they used to know. Instead, they came to know him as an honest businessman, a landlord known for treating his tenants with genuine kindness and patience, a man who never forgot what it truly felt like to struggle just to put food on the table. Whenever one of his tenants fell behind on rent because of real, honest hardship, Michael never raised his voice the way that landlord once had. He remembered too clearly the frightened family standing on that roadside years ago, and he made a quiet promise to himself never to become the reason someone else felt that same fear. So many people convince themselves that a small salary is the only reason they can never build real wealth. But the truth, as Michael eventually discovered, is often far simpler and far more uncomfortable. The real problem is rarely the size of the paycheck itself. It's the absence of any real plan for it. Michael's salary didn't change first. His habits did. He stopped trying to look wealthy in front of others and started quietly working to become genuinely financially secure. Along the way, he learned that real wealth is never built in a single payday, no matter how large that payday might be. It is built one deliberate decision at a time, one saved dollar at a time, one small, boring, unglamorous habit repeated patiently over months and years until it finally becomes something real. Remember this: you don't need to earn millions of dollars to begin changing the direction of your future. You simply need to become faithful with whatever you already have in your hands right now, however small it may seem today. Because a salary can feed you for a single month, but wisdom, real, patient, disciplined wisdom, can provide for an entire lifetime. So let me leave you with one final question. When your next paycheck lands in your account, will it simply disappear the way it always has? Or will you finally let it become the very first brick in the foundation of a completely different future? Tell us in the comments below, what is one single habit you're going to change starting today? If this story touched something in you, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope today. Your next paycheck could become the first brick in the future you've been quietly praying for all along. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.